Dear friends, this is Dr. Dhingra and you're watching Chill Pill Dilemma. Today we are going to talk about war and how it affects the people of a country and especially the children. Um, we know that that's the worst thing that can happen to a country, and sometimes wars could be civil wars that people are fighting within one country with each other. And when I say war, what I mean is armed conflict. So I'm not talking about like just basic rioting and all. I'm talking about proper war, either it's civil or between two countries. Um, we have with us Ms. Xiomara Borja, who's a licensed clinical social worker, and she works with kids. So we're going to talk to her and discuss how wars impact children, especially. So welcome, Ms. Borja.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. So wars have been going on for centuries, and in all the foreseeable future, they'll continue. It's not a good thing, but that's how it is. Um, Children are vulnerable, more vulnerable than adults. So what can you tell us about how the horrors of war affect children?
Okay, well, children are not an exception to the casualty that comes from armed conflict, right? Children are exposed to very dangerous and situations and often are victims of very violent deaths. Examples are bombings, shootings. There are even colorful landmines that sometimes children will confuse for toys. And if they're not killed or met with death, they're faced with serious life-threatening injuries where they are left clinging for their lives, right? An agonizing death. And those that miraculously survive are left with very serious disabilities and illnesses with access to actually no access to health care or treatment. So it's often very tough and they're greatly affected, and their parents are unable to really provide for them in the sense of medical treatment.
Okay, so physical injury is, of course, something that can happen. What else can children go through?
Well, despite death or disability and injury, then we have sexual violence, right, which goes kind of hand in hand with war. They're exposed to rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancies, forced terminations, forced marriages. And you'll often hear of children contracting sexually transmitted diseases. Young girls can die during childbirth. They can have very serious injuries to their reproductive organs. And sexual violence is just not limited to girls. Boys are often also victims.
Mm-hmm. So these are some direct ways that the kids can be harmed. But there must be some other ways also that the kids can be harmed, like maybe indirect, maybe long-term harms. So what are the other ways that children are harmed because of these armed conflicts?
Well, they also have their unmet basic needs, right? So that, includes access to food, to water, to shelter, to the health services that are needed for routine or emergency care, and education. So, which results in long-term negative effects on the child's physical and mental, emotional well-being. The parents are, hyper-focused on survival. They're focused on trying to find shelter, trying to find food for their children. So they're also deprived of that healthy, normal parent-child relationship.
Mm-hmm. So you said education is impaired. I guess if there's a direct destruction of schools and other educational institutions, that's one way. But even if schools are still there because of the war, people will be too scared to send their children to schools. They would rather
Yeah,
keep them safe somewhere
yeah.
else.
And not even the parents, the teachers and the administration that run the schools are often in fear or oftentimes are also called into war. And even if there were teachers that wanted to continue the education, parents are so focused on survival that attendance would probably be very minimal to probably non-existent.
Right. So what it means is that even if the war finishes, the long-term harms are still done. If a child loses a few years of education, then that he's not going to get back, right? And
Correct.
you also mentioned health related issues. Again, in that direct injury and all that is there, diseases are there that can spread because of the war going on. But if the infrastructure is also bombed and now there are no more hospitals left, right? So healthcare is impacted in that way also. Okay. So our understanding so far is that it's not just one way that the war can affect children. There are so many different ways, some short-term problems, some long-term problems. I want to talk a bit about how war can affect a child's brain because the child's brain is still developing, right?
Correct.
So in this process, there are new nerve connections being made in the brain. The ones which are not necessary, they die out. So this is called pruning of the synapses. And as the kids grow, depending on their experiences and their states of mind, their emotions, the useful connections are retained and they become more, whereas the other connections which are not used, they die out. But if a child is living in a country that has ongoing war, then he is not able to have a normal emotional and cognitive development because now the whole you know thinking is surrounding around safety and survival basically. So that is affected. Another thing that can happen is that it can affect a child's immunity. Now you would ask, how can that happen? Well, when we are in a state of stress, physical changes happen in the body, like release of certain hormones. So for short-term responses, there's adrenaline. In short term, it's a good thing that, if you have adrenaline in your system, that can prepare you to fight or flee the situation. But if the trauma continues for a long time, then it's not good to have uh, this hormone in high quantities in your blood all the time. The other one is cortisol. That hormone is also supposed to have anti-stress effect, but if it stays in your blood for a long time, it has its own problems. So these things can impair immunity, can also lead to other health problems. And the other thing that's very obvious is that if there's not enough food, there are nutritional deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, malnutrition, and that can lead to death too.
Yes.
So these are the biological things that I wanted to talk about. So let's talk a bit about some of the other um, aspects, like, for example, attachment theory. So what is your opinion about attachment theory and how it affects,
So
you
the
know,
attachment theory for children during war is it's constantly lacking because of the fact that there is so much disruption in their in the life between that parent and that child. Parents are not focused on being emotionally present for their children. They're focusing on survival, sometimes even day-to-day survival. Where am I going to sleep tonight? How am I going to feed my children today? Right? How am I going to get this one meal or this next meal? So that's their primary focus. Now, they're also parents that are traumatized themselves and having their own mental health challenges. And in addition to that, the children sometimes even lose their parents when their parent is leaving to go find food or leaving to go find shelter, and have their children stay put while they come back. And sometimes they don't come back. So they are unable to form that healthy attachment style. Often it's very often, and we have to remember that a lot of children are born into war. So the attachment, even from very early, from birth to early childhood, is disrupted.
So one thing is that parents may not be available emotionally or physically so that kids can form attachments. Forming an attachment is a biological need. So if parents are not there, they will get attached to something else or someone else.
Yes.
And what can happen? See, if in a war zone, kids may be in frequent contact with militiamen or warlords. They may get attached to them or the whole philosophy of war. And so it's they're getting attached to a wrong thing. But since it's a biological need, they cannot stop it. So in the long run, yes, there's so many long-term sequel that can happen, which leads us to the moral and spiritual aspects of how these aspects are affected because of war.
Well, how I mentioned, some of them are born into war, right? So they're born into, this is my normal life. This is what exists. They are raised to lie, to steal, for survival. Sometimes even for the females to sell sex for survival. They procreate at times to continue the war, to continue the war from continuing. You know what I mean is, they want the war to continue and they need more soldiers. So oftentimes they're just procreating for the purposes of having more soldiers because this is what they're taught to do. This is even how they came to be, right? They were born to be soldiers and they're trained from very, very early on. So it's very unfortunate. It's very normal for a lot of them and they do not know anything else.
Right. So in a way, violence becomes normal. That's a normal thing. Like for us, doing our things, doing chores, working is a normal thing. For those kids, violence is like a regular activity.
Yeah, they
But
can't
then,
imagine anything else. They can't imagine anything else. They don't know what it's like to live in a normal, healthy, functioning society where there's a supermarket or there's a doctor's office or I go daily to school. Some have never even experienced it, so they do not even know what it feels like. They've heard stories maybe, but oftentimes they never had that experience.
what would you say about trauma? Because most kids are genuinely traumatized. So what symptoms can they have?
Well, they would have the typical PTSD symptoms, which would be the distressing dreams, the nightmares, flashbacks, constantly reliving the trauma, trying to avoid certain memories of what they saw, of what they experienced, trying to avoid external things that trigger their memories. They might be very hyper vigilant and some become very irritable and angry and continue a cycle of violence. And last but not least, the changes in mood and overall functioning and cognition even.
Right. So far we've discussed certain changes in the body which are more fluid. And what I mean by that is that if war ends fast and the rehabilitation happens, many of those negative changes could be reversed, whether it's synaptic connections or hormonal changes in the body. But if something continues for a long time, a trauma continues for a long time, then there could be permanent changes in the brain. And I'm talking about neuroplasticity. So what that means is that through various experiences, the brain transforms, connections become permanent. So even if the war is over, trauma is over, those negative connections still stay. So a child may be in a state of uh, fight or flee mode, or may continue to have these symptoms of trauma for a long time, even if after the trauma is over. So that's another long-term problem. So we've talked about the problems. Now, how should we look at war when it comes to the treatment part? What are the different ways the societies or governments should address this problem so that the children do not have to go through this?
Well, primarily we want to focus on avoiding war to begin with, right? How can it be stopped? How can we prevent it from even starting? That would be first. Secondary would be when it's happening, like what can we do to provide some type of support, whether it's to make things a little bit less damaging than they are already are, helping with basic needs, water, food, assistance with reuniting unaccompanied children, legal aid for war crimes that exist, humanitarian ceasefires for areas where there's significant life-threatening injuries and where immediate assistance is needed. And for those that we can reintegrate at a certain point in time, being able to identify who those are and start, with those that have a higher chance of reintegration at the moment while they're still in war, that is.
And
And
then,
then third is like once the war is actually over, right? How do we rehabilitate the victims that have been living this lifestyle for such a long time, right? How do we starting with medical, right? And then going to a psychological portion. And as you mentioned before, due to all the changes that happen with the brain, it will be a very long process. And oftentimes these folks are experience repeated traumas, which result in some intense psychiatric and mental health treatment
and
options.
rehabilitation issues could also be different for adults versus the children, for example. Now, in the first place, it's a costly thing. So people who have lost their limbs or they've been injured, the medical treatment that's required could be really expensive, and even the facilities may not be there. But even if we talk about a simple amputation of legs, something happened, mine's exploded. First, it'll take a long time for an adult to get a prosthetic limb because it's not so easily available in many countries. But if it happens, that's good. That's just a one-time thing. But for children, you provide a child with a prosthetic limb, and next year the child grows and that limb is not useful anymore. So now he needs a new one. How many times can he be provided these prosthetic limbs until he becomes an adult? So these are practical issues,
Yeah,
cost
especially with
issues.
no medical insurance, right? Or those type of privileges that we have here, right? So it is very common, and sometimes they'll go without, stuff, right? They outgrow it, which is sad. And in addition to that, we talk about the prosthetics, but how about the children that lose their vision or lose their hearing, right? There's just so many different situations where they can be affected, and the long-term damages and supports are still not available for them.
Right. And we also look at it from a society point of view, like children are tomorrow's adults.
Correct.
If they survive the war, but they have all these problems that we just discussed, that's the next generation. So it means war happens now, and 20 years later, those adults who are children now, they will have very limited capacity to either work or, be useful members of society. So it's like a whole generation is affected with economical and societal.
It's a cycle.
So it's a cycle.
Yeah.
That instability leads to further, problems and wars and further continuation of this whole thing. As you said, it's a cycle. So I think we covered a lot of important points. I know this is not comprehensive. There are so many other things which are also important, but we touched upon the basics. I really thank you, Ms. Borja, for joining me today on this discussion, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thank you, Dr. Dhingra. Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care.